So last year I made a video on how to make an 8-point star, and today I'm going to redo that video. There was a lot of trial and error that went on in that video because I was basically trying to figure out how to make an 8-point star for the very first time. And it took me a while to figure out all the angles and the measurements. But in this video, I think I'm going to be a lot more organized. I'm going to be readjusting some of the measurements. I'm going to have some plans available on Patreon for the 8-point star. And I'm also going to have plans available for the steep angle jig. And for those of you that don't want to make a steep angle jig, because it does take some extra time, I'm going to have some alternatives for you so you can skip that step, but still end up with an 8-point star. So, a lot to cover. I think it'll be more organized. I'm not saying it'll be a shorter video, but hopefully it'll make more sense for you guys. So the plans that I'm going to provide will work with any 1x4 or 2x4, and it will also work for people that are working with reclaimed lumber who need to run it through a joiner and a table saw. And if you end up with at least 3 1/4 inches wide, you can still use these plans. If you go below 3 1/4, I don't think it's going to work. Now, I like using recycled lumber or reclaimed lumber, and I found this 2x4 on a beach probably about 6 months ago. So it's been drying in my garage, and then I brought it upstairs to dry a little bit more, straightened it up a little bit, and I think we're good to go. So 2x4 today. And by the way, the steep angle jig that I made for today can accommodate for 2x4s and 1x4s. So a little bit of versatility there for you guys. All you have to do is take a spacer out to use it with 1x4s, or put the spacer back in to use it with 2x4s. These toggle clamps don't have quite enough range to be able to accommodate for a 2x4 and a 1x4 at the same time. So that was kind of my workaround there. All right, so we are going to be splitting this up into 3 sections. We're going to start by cutting all the pieces labeled A, all the pieces labeled B, and then the final piece labeled C. Now, as you can tell, this is in the shape of the Star of Bethlehem, but I will also be giving you some variations that you can make later on in the video that use all the exact same pieces, which is kind of cool. All right, so let's start with the A's. So the goal when cutting this piece is to cut the point at a 36-degree angle, and then the inner angle at 54 degrees. So as a visual for you guys, I placed this template on this 2x4 here, and you can see it's not quite the full width of the 2x4. And I did that on purpose because if I made it the full width, then the final piece labeled C wouldn't fit. It would be too small. So everything that I'm showing you here today is very specific to your stock being at least 3 1/4 inches wide. And if your stock is a full 3 1/2 inches wide, this will still work. If you wanted to, you could watch my older video which shows me using the full 3 1/2 inch stock, and you do get a slightly larger star. The angles are the same, but the measurements are different. So the first thing we're going to try to cut is the 36-degree angle point. Now in order to cut this point, you're going to be setting your saw to 54 degrees. And some of you guys might be wondering why that is. Basically, I'm giving you the geometrical angles on my plans, but the angles in geometry are a little bit different than the angles on your miter saw. Basically, the 0 degrees on a protractor is different than the 0 degrees on a miter saw. On a miter saw, it starts at 90. So the calculation there is basically 90 minus 36 to give you 54 degrees. I'm just letting you guys know that because when I was a beginner, this stuff totally messed me up. Now the calculations later on are going to get a little bit more complicated, and to be honest, I'm probably not going to get into the calculations for the rest of the star. I'm just going to show you how to set the saw up because I think that's probably what's most important here. All right, so there you go. Your saw is set at 54 degrees. You're going to make a cut at the end of the board, and then you're going to measure 5 inches and 3/8, mark it, and that's where you'll be making your next cut with your saw set at 54 degrees. And I like to set up a stop block here to make it a little bit easier for me. And then I just go ahead and I cut 3 of these pieces. And I end up with 3 diamond-shaped pieces. Or parallelograms. And now for the 54-degree angle cut. So for this one, I set my saw to 45 degrees. Then I set up a 0 clearance fence, and I slide it right up against my blade. Then I mark 5 3/16 on my workpiece. And I line up that mark with the corner of that zero clearance fence. And that's where I'll be making the next cut. But to hold this thing in place, I like to use this little jig that I made. And this is a simple little jig that you can make pretty easily. Just slide this over here, clamp everything against the fence, and you've got a really nice solid system for holding this piece into place. Now, if you don't want to make that jig, I completely understand. There is another option for you. You simply take the 2x4 that you just cut, slide it in over here, clamp it down. You'll also need to clamp the zero clearance fence, and you're good to go. It's not quite as good, but it does a decent job. I'll give you a close-up of this jig here because I don't have plans. It's one of those things that's just so simple that I didn't really feel like making plans. That angle there is cut at the same angle as your workpiece. So you cut that at 54 degrees on your saw. And I'll leave a link for some toggle clamps in the description. Now, before I make my cut, I like to add 3 strips of masking tape onto my saw here. I find if I don't, my workpiece will tilt over just slightly in the center there, and my cut will be a little bit off square. And this little hack seems to work great. I should probably make my own zero clearance plate at some point, but I haven't gotten around to that yet. All right, so simply make your first cut at 45 degrees here, and then you just rotate it over and make another one. As simple as that. And then you've got your 36-degree angle point and your 54-degree angle point. Easy peasy. So now it's time to cut all the pieces that are labeled B. And this is going to be pretty easy because it's the exact same angles as the A pieces, only flipped around. So in this case, the 36-degree angle is actually part of the inner angles of the star, and the 54-degree angle will be part of the outer point of the star. So the same, only flipped around, which is kind of cool. So you're going to set your saw back to 54 degrees. You're already going to have a cut at the end of your board here. Simply mark it 3 3/4 inches. And that's how long you'll be cutting 4 of these pieces at. And to get the 54-degree angle cut, again, you're going to set your saw to 45 degrees. It's the exact same setup with all the jigs here, but you're going to be making the cut at 3.5 inches instead of 5 3/16. But before I make that cut, I just want to show you a couple of things because I think it's important to talk about this. So the goal here is to make sure that this facet here on the A piece matches up with the facet on the B piece. Now, according to my plans, it is 3.5 inches. And I did get 3.5 inches on my A piece. And therefore, if I cut the B piece at 3.5 inches, it should fit perfectly. Now, if you by chance cut your A piece a little bit too small or a little bit too big, the length of that facet will be a little bit different. It might be a little bit more than 3.5. It might be a little bit less. Now, the way that I've designed these plans is to allow for these types of minor errors, which are actually quite common when building projects like this. For example, if I set my stop block a little too far to the right, my pieces would be a little bit bigger and the facet would be a little bit more than 3.5 inches. In that case, I would simply put these two pieces together, make my mark there, and cut them slightly longer. These plans will still allow for that if you're within probably 1/16 or a couple millimeters off. Plans are nice to have, but there's this thing called reality, and stuff happens, right? Anyhow, mine all lined up at 3.5 inches, so we're going to be making the cut at 3.5 inches. And as you can see, after cutting my first piece, I actually cut them slightly too long, so the facets don't match up. And that's basically because I set my jig up a little too far to the left. Now, an easy fix to this, instead of having to reset up my jig, is just using 2 playing cards, sliding them in as a shim, and recutting my piece. And now my facets line up perfectly. All right, so we finally made it to the last piece here. We're going to be cutting this one labeled C. This is the one with the really steep angle. And we're going to be using this awesome little jig here for that. And once again, if you don't want to make this jig, keep watching. I will have some options for you later on. So the goal here is to cut this steep angle at 22.5 degrees. And after that, we're going to cut the inner angle at 54 degrees. For the jig setup, it's actually pretty simple. You set your saw to 0 degrees, you slide the jig so it's right up against the blade, and then you clamp it to the fence. Now I will have plans available for this jig as well as the 8-point star on my Patreon, and I'm actually going to be giving them away for pretty cheap, at least up until the end of the year. I think in January of 2025, I'm probably going to put the price up for this thing, but for now, you can get it for $2. And actually, the $2 is for a membership tier on Patreon. So if you pay $2 to be a member, you can actually access a whole bunch of different things, not just the 8-point star, but you can also access the plans for the 3D star jig and a whole bunch of different templates for wooden trees, arrows, and other little things. So it's actually a pretty good deal for $2. But just until the end of 2024. Yeah, I feel like that's a pretty good deal for now. All right, moving on. So the angle of this jig is set at 22.5. Oh, and I should mention the base here. I just used a 1/4 inch piece of plywood, but in the plans, I'm actually going to be recommending a minimum of 1/2 inch just to make everything a little bit stronger. So basically all you got to do, take your 2x4, stick it in here, line up the corner of the 2x4 with the corner of the jig, clamp it down, and you are set to go. It is that easy. And what I love about this is you don't have to hold the workpiece with your hand. The clamps are going to do the work, and it's a lot safer than having to hold it with your hand. And the other thing I did was line the base of the jig with sandpaper. And this makes a huge difference with, let's call it, grip power. Here's an example of me sliding a piece of wood on something with no sandpaper versus sandpaper. Major difference there. So I highly recommend that. All right, so let's go ahead and make the cut. Now that actually went pretty smooth. The only thing I noticed was actually the rollers on my blade guard getting snagged a little bit on the 2x4. Not the actual toggle clamps. When I'm using this jig with a 1x4, the rollers just roll right over the 1x4 and it's not a problem. I didn't even think of this being an issue with a 2x4, but I don't think it's a huge deal. I did have to lift my guard with my hand, which I didn't like, but I just thought I'd give you guys a heads up on that. But overall, I think it worked quite well. And this jig is so simple to make that I'm actually going to make several more of these jigs, but at different angles for other different star projects. And now that you've got that steep angle, we're going to be cutting the inner angles. Now things get a little juicy here because I could give you an exact angle, but instead I'm going to give you a range of angles. And I know this is going to sound crazy, all right? But here's the thing. Geometrically or mathematically, however you want to word it, you should be setting your saw to 51.75 degrees in order to get the 54-degree angle that we're looking for if your workpiece is tilted at this weird 22.5-degree angle. In reality, however, in my video from last year, I ended up using 52.5. And in this video, as you'll see later on, what ended up working was 52 degrees. So I'm going to give you a range here of 51.75 to 52.5. And I think what's happening here is basically I'm somewhere along the way, I'm making small errors in either my jig setup or when I'm setting my saw to 54 degrees. Now this goes way back to the beginning, right? When I'm setting my saw to 54 degrees, and when you're setting your saw to 54 degrees, how do you know it's at exactly 54 degrees? Maybe instead of being exactly 54, it's actually 54.2. And that right there is enough to throw everything off. Now, throwing everything off is not a big deal as long as you know how to fix it. And I usually talk about this in almost every single one of my star videos, because it's never as simple as just setting your saw to one angle and it working out. I always need to make what I like to call micro adjustments, where I come back to my saw and I just tap it over a little bit, make an adjustment, recut the angles, and then everything fits together perfectly. Now, the cool thing about this is that I've designed this so that when we're cutting the C piece, it's going to be about 1/4 inch too long. Now, this is pretty cool because this gives you the opportunity to cut your angle. Let's say you chose to cut it at 52 degrees, which is what I'm going to actually recommend for this video, and you go to fit it and it's not quite right. You still have a lot of extra room left on this piece to readjust the angle just slightly and recut them. You can actually recut it several times before this piece becomes too small for the star. All right. So with that being said, I started at 52.5 degrees, and I'll just show you what happened just to give you some visuals here. So I started at 52.5, I make the cut, I flip it over, I make another cut, and when I go to fit it in, it was almost perfect, but you could tell it's a little bit too steep. So all I did was take it back to the saw, I moved my stop block over a little bit, and I readjusted my angle to 52 degrees. I recut the piece, tested it out again, and it is perfect. So this angle was perfect for me with everything I did during this project. This is how it lined up. The only thing is now, this piece is too long. And you can tell because there's a little bit of overhang here, which is a perfectly easy fix, and this is all part of the process. Now that I know my angles are perfectly aligned, all I have to do is go back to the saw, I leave the angle the same, and I recut my workpiece a little bit shorter. Now, I typically take about half the width of the blade off at a time, but in total, I did end up shaving off almost 1/4 inch before I got this piece fitting in here nice and snug with no overhang. Well, I hope that makes sense. I figure there's no point in just giving you an angle and then saying good luck when I know that there's going to be some variations that occur in the building process. So I hope that helps you guys out. Now, obviously, that entire process of cutting the C piece was ridiculous, right? So if you wanted to skip that step entirely, here's what you can do. Instead of making an 8-point star that looks like this, you're simply going to get rid of that C piece altogether and make a star that looks like this. So you're going to cut 4 of the A pieces instead of 3 and 4 of the B pieces and completely forget about the C piece. And I went ahead and cut an extra A piece just so I could show you what the star looks like. So here's what this star looks like. And I have a feeling this is probably going to be a big hit because it is so fast and easy to make, doesn't require any jigs, and it looks really good. Honestly, after I made this, I kind of felt like restarting the entire video, not filming another video about the Star of Bethlehem, and just doing a video on this. That's how much I like this. Of course, the Star of Bethlehem is a unique star in itself, and it does pose a lot of extra challenges. So I decided to do both. And on the flip side, if you do end up making that steep angle jig, there's actually a third option for you. You can make a star that looks like this, where you're cutting 4 of the C pieces and 4 of the B pieces and none of the A pieces. And that would give you a star that resembles more of a nautical star. So there you go. You can make 3 different types of stars using all the same pieces with the same measurements and angles. So the video's not quite over yet. Now we need to assemble this star. So I'm going to use my usual technique that I like to use, which is dowel joinery. And for that, I basically make my own jig that kind of resembles a pocket hole jig, but it's for dowels instead of screws. And I've got a separate video on how to make this, which I'll link in the description below. But before we put the dowels in, we need to glue the star together. So the first thing I do simply lay down some parchment paper, and I use wood glue. In this case, I'm using Type Bond 3, which is a nice, strong, high-quality glue. And it's just as simple as gluing all the pieces together. So I put glue on each surface, and what I like about using wood glue as opposed to a hot glue gun is that I have lots of time to slide my pieces around to make sure that everything's lined up perfectly. Once I have everything in the right position, I just leave it there to dry. Once it's dry, it's time to reinforce the star. Now, why do I reinforce the star? I wanted to touch on this a little bit, because I don't think I ever really explained that properly in the past. Now, I will agree with you that with the surface area involved with 2x4 stock, this is going to be really, really strong with just the glue. But you might still run into the problem that I've sometimes had with expansion and contraction of wood. This has only happened to a few of my stars, but sometimes maybe the wood wasn't dry enough. When I bring the star into my home, I notice the wood contracting, and then I start getting gaps at the outer parts of the star. Now, if I didn't reinforce the star, I'm pretty sure those joints would separate and the star would maybe just fall apart. So that's why I like to put dowels in there. Let's take a look at this 8-point star from last year, for example. I can tell that there was a little bit of shrinkage here. And you can see the gaps forming on the outer part of the star. But I'm not at all worried about the integrity of the star because there are dowels going right through this joint. Now, one recommendation that I usually get from people is to put a piece of plywood on the back or a backing on the back, just glue it on and nail it on. I actually used to do this, but I had to stop doing it because I encountered a problem. By gluing a piece of wood on the back, it didn't allow for the natural expansion and contraction of wood. And what I noticed is that my star would start cupping over time, and when it cupped, it would start forming gaps at the outer joints of the star. And you can tell just by me spinning this how cupped it is. Now, if you're looking for a quick and easy way to reinforce, most people probably wouldn't mind a little cupping. But I wanted to make sure that I was building and teaching the proper way. There's always so much to talk about when I'm making things. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and drill these holes. This is pretty cool. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. I basically just clamp my jig to one of my pieces, line it up at the corner here, and drill. Spin the star around, drill again, drill again, drill again. It's really, really simple. You guys can go watch that other video I made on how to make this jig. And you're going to need different angles for 2x4s versus 1x4s. And I also made one for 3D stars. But yeah, I show you exactly how to make this step by step in that video. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory there. And it really doesn't take too long. Anyways, so once I got the holes in there, I just tap some dowels in there. Let the glue dry, trim them down, sand them, and you end up with really neat and tidy joints in the back. Not really a big deal, it's the back of the star, but that's probably just me overthinking again. So once everything was assembled, it was time to finish everything, and basically I spent a ridiculous amount of time sanding by hand. And there were a couple of spots where the router bit had torn the wood a little bit when I was putting the bevels in. And so I had to do some putty work there. And as for the gaps in the star, there really weren't that many. There was a couple of spots that had a little bit of a gap, and I would attribute that to using reclaimed lumber. But overall, it actually fit together really nicely. And after putting a little bit of varnish on here, this is the final product. Now, I will admit, I wasn't really happy with the final look of the star. I expected a little bit more character to come from that reclaimed lumber, and it just wasn't quite enough for me. So I think I probably will end up refinishing this at a future date, but that's okay because that really wasn't the point of this video. The point of this video is to get a little bit better at cutting those angles, explaining to people how to cut those angles, making plans, making jigs, having things available for you on Patreon, coming up with alternative stars that you can make with the same pieces, and options for people who don't want to make jigs. So I think I was able to accomplish what I set out to do, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to check out my Patreon. It's a really good deal right now. For $2, you can get plans for the 8-point star, the steep angle jig, the 3D star jig, and a few other templates for making cool little Christmas trees and other small projects. I'm probably going to change the price in January, but I just wanted to keep it simple and cheap for you guys until the end of 2024 and then deal with that in the new year. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.